I've often said that most of League's early champions were created by just taking a generic character archetype, or sometimes just an existing character altogether, and throwing them into the game with a legally distinct design. There are a handful of older characters that break that mold, though, and I think few of them stand out as a better example of said mold breaking than Amumu, the sad mummy. I mean, this is such a bizarre concept when you actually stop and think about it. Like, Riot could have just stopped at the concept of a mummy, but then they decided to take it a step further and make him a mummified child who's always depressed. In fact, his sorrow is so intense that his tears are actually capable of hurting people around him. So, why is Amumu so sad? Well, that's always been kind of a mystery. In his original lore, Amumu just woke up in a tomb, and after realizing that he was dead, found himself overwhelmed by an intense longing for his parents, something still displayed in his splash art. Why Amumu suddenly reanimated in the first place, or even who his parents might be, however, no one knew, not even Amumu himself. Amumu's original lore at least gave him some solace by offering him a home and even friends in the Institute of War. But, of course, that no longer exists in the current canon. Amumu's current lore, well, it's got some ups and downs. Before we can even get into that, though, we need to briefly talk about the song that Riot spontaneously released to promote Amumu's lore update. The Sad Mummy is a music video that more or less sets the tone for the direction of Amumu's new lore. In the current canon, he's supposedly meant to be something of a myth or fairy tale, a shrew fable told to young children in bed or around a campfire. Most don't truly believe in him, but of course this is Runeterra, so there's more truth behind the myth than most realize. Basically, Amumu is wandering around Runeterra in search of a friend, but suffers from a curse that prevents him from making any. What sort of curse? Well, to answer that, we now have to take a proper look at Amumu's new backstory, or backstories. Amumu's bio can basically be summed up as follows. No one actually truly knows who Amumu was in life, so we get like 4 different legends that may or may not explain his existence. Everything about his true identity and the reason for why he is reanimated is basically a total mystery. What we do know is that he was apparently found sobbing by himself in a tomb by an ambitious treasure hunter. When Amumu tried to grasp the treasure hunter's hand, asking for friendship, the treasure hunter's whole arm withered and turned to dust. Naturally, he fled, but left the door wide open for Amumu to wander out of the tomb at last. Okay, so overall, I kind of like this direction for Amumu. He's a sad, cursed mummy child with no memories of his past and an intense sorrow he can't overcome, forced to remain forever alone because he basically kills any living thing he touches. It keeps more or less the same basic gist of his original story, but adds an extra layer of tragedy on top of that. I don't even necessarily mind the idea of Amumu being this borderline mythical figure, even though that feels kind of redundant since Rammus kind of already does the same thing. The real issue that I have is the whole multiple choice backstory situation. One version claims that he was a sickly Shuriman prince who accidentally infected his own servant. The girl's grandmother placed a curse on him to basically trap Amumu in a sickly state for all eternity. Another version states that Amumu was a greedy prince who unwittingly cursed himself with an artifact called the Eye of Angor. Another even claims that Amumu was Shurima's first and only Yordle emperor, which raises a lot of questions, and that he died of sadness due to witnessing human cruelty. All of these versions may have some degree of truth to them, or maybe none of them do. We don't know for sure, and I don't think Riot does either. If you've been following Runeterra's lore for long enough, you'll know that the writers have had a tendency to just set up mysteries that are either intended to never be resolved, or that they just decide to come back to years later. The clear and obvious direction for Amumu's character arc would have him be uncovering some lead about his own identity and the curse that afflicts him. But goodness knows when or if we'll ever properly see that arc play out. Really, though, I guess my biggest complaint is that it all just seems kind of unnecessary. Like, did we really need to make this a whole mystery in the first place? Would Amumu's story and direction really have been impacted that much if they just chose one origin and stuck with it? Or at the very least, you could have written his bio starting from Amumu's awakening in the tomb and then detailing his adventures around Shurima, rather than devoting the entire thing to possible origin stories that may or may not all be complete nonsense. I mean, Riot seems to be leaning slightly towards the Yordle backstory, but that doesn't work since they arbitrarily decided that Yordles are immortal and completely unkillable. Whoops. They also kind of fumbled the opportunity to actually make Amumu look like a Yordle by committing to his current design in the music video. Which is a shame because there's a pretty iconic fan rework of that very concept by Andre Castaneda. But I guess they wanted to keep Amumu as this weird bobblehead mummy to avoid potentially spoiling the mystery of what's actually contained beneath his wrappings. Overall, I don't really hate Amumu's lore. It certainly doesn't annoy me on the same level as other champions that we've talked about before. If anything, it just feels like an opportunity wasted to give him an actual backstory. I mean, we've got plenty of living folktale characters in Runeterra already. If you wanted to set up a mystery surrounding the Sad Mummy's origin, you could have at least settled on a single backstory and only dropped vague hints as to what it was. I mean, the treasure hunter in Amumu's short story describes a bunch of hieroglyphs that seem to vaguely imply Amumu's true history anyways. But they're vague enough that the actual context can be left to interpretation. But what do you all think? Do you like Amumu's approach to setting up a mystery backstory, or should Riot have just chosen a direction and gone with it? Leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I'll see you all next time.